Start recording. Okay. Once again, hi everyone. Welcome to session number 2 of our ethics series on One Health and Conservation. I'm Bernie Traversari, and I am the Managing Director of the Society for Conservation Biology North America. As a reminder, this series is being hosted by SCBNA. For those of you that are not familiar with SCBNA, we are a professional society dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. We essentially support anyone and everyone engaged in conservation in North America, which for our society means the US and Canada. And we do that in a variety of different ways. We provide professional development opportunities like today's session. We also host a number of research and publication journals that are available to society members and non-members. And we also host a biannual conference, the next iteration of which will take place this summer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and will be co-hosted with the Society for Ecological Restoration. So we do a lot, all in an effort to support those involved in conservation within our region. I would also like to point out that this entire series, as well as our past ethics series in 2025, is being organized in collaboration with PanWorks. PanWorks is an ethics think tank focused on the well-being of animals. We thank PanWorks for their work in helping us design and implement this series, and look forward to collaborating with them in the future. A brief reminder that if you are not a part of SCBNA, we always encourage folks to join our society. You can do so for free. We have a new associate membership that is available to anyone that needs it, and it provides you with a number of benefits that you're able to access. And those include access to our journals and also discounts for our conference and other conferences, including our international congress. So please join. I will also add all relevant links, including our membership link, to the chat after I'm done with this brief introduction. Okay, so another brief reminder. This webinar series is focused on exploring the topic of One Health as it applies to conservation. Our first session about 2 weeks ago covered the basics of One Health. And then we have one more session that's going to explore real-world examples of One Health being used in conservation through specifically mountain gorilla conservation. So we encourage everyone that's here today to register for that additional session. The registration link can be found on our website, same place you find the registration link for today's session. And we look forward to seeing everyone in a couple of weeks. Okay, last bit from me. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Fred Koontz. Fred is a member of SCBNA's policy committee, and he is also an emeritus fellow at PanWorks. Fred today will be talking about the historical and practical considerations for One Health project, so providing more of a historical perspective of One Health as it has been applied to conservation. Fred, thank you so much for being here today and for leading today's presentation. I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Bernie. Can you turn on my slides or do I do that?
You should be able to on your own.
Okay. All right. Can you see them? Good.
Looking
Okay.
good.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming today and zooming in. I had to laugh when Bill and Bernie asked me to talk about the early history of One Health and how that early history might inform your projects today. Because when I was a child, my mother was a history buff, and she was also an eighth grade American history teacher. And so she insisted that on our summer vacations, we had to go visit historical sites. So to me, this was like a complete waste of a summer vacation day. But I have to say that, whoops, uh-oh, it's not forwarding. Hmm. Help, Bernie. It's not forwarding.
Uh,
Oh,
Clicking on
there
the
we
screen.
go.
There we go.
Okay, great. Okay, sorry, I'm getting organized here. So I have to say that now that I'm in my seventh decade of life, history is much more interesting when you lived it. And so I'm lucky that I had a 50-year career, really. I was one of those high school kids that got inspired by the first Earth Day, and I ended up getting a PhD in zoology, and then found a career working in wildlife conservation. I like to say from A to Z. I worked from academia as an adjunct at Columbia University, but then I worked in zoos, curator of mammals at the Bronx Zoo, field director at the Woodland Park Zoo. And along the way, I worked in nature centers. And so I really had a chance to experience all the different aspects of wildlife conservation and watch the profession and the interests expand over the last 50 years. So today, what I want to do is really highlight from 1984 to 2004 when I worked at the Wildlife Conservation Society. At the time, I was at the Bronx Zoo as a curator and a research director, and then later at Wildlife Trust, which was involved in the formation of conservation medicine, which helped lead to One Health. And so I want to really review some of the historical foundation, but this is really a personal reflection, really more that I was in a position to be an observer of lots of discussions about when we started really kind of linking conservation, biodiversity conservation, and human health and animal health. And the idea of kind of going through this history is to come up with some considerations for implementing contemporary One Health. One Health is, it's a big idea. It's a framework or a paradigm. Oops. And it's not the only conservation paradigm, of course. There's been, many. The protected area management really could be thought of as a conservation paradigm. And, it evolved into national parks, conservation easements. Biodiversity hotspots was a paradigm. Community conservation. I mean, there's been many. And One Health is one of those paradigms. And over my career, one thing that I noticed about conservation paradigms is they often emerge in a context. They often hatch in the hive. And what I mean by that is that um, most of these ideas really weren't the result of like one person coming up with the idea, but that they were built on the ideas of others. Conservation paradigms like One Health, they evolve and change with time. They reflect the adopter's values, but often covertly that the values we seem to have in conservation biology somewhat of a fear of talking about ethics. And they all require language clarity. So let's keep these in mind as we move on today to talk about One Health. The context. If you look at this slide and kind of jog your memory of the times that led up to One Health in the early 2000s, start in the upper left-hand corner. After World War II, conservation organizations began to develop. Nature Conservancy in 1951. Of course, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book was really a book that helped motivate people towards conservation. While World Wide Fund for Nature started in 1961. And then by 1970, I was in high school, and that's when I really got inspired. I was one of those Earth Day babies, I guess, that was inspired, and the public started hearing about conservation and ecology. Of course, the 70s were when the environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act, Air and Water Clean Act developed. 1981 was when Michael Soule edited his book on conservation biology. And the Society for Conservation Biology started in 1985. And all of you that were around in those times working, remember we talked about habitat loss, invasive species, overexploitation, climate change, and pollution as sort of ideas. By the time we got to the 1980s and 90s, we really started to address the problems, and we came up with all kinds of different solutions. Again, things like biodiversity hotspots, protected area management. Uh, Dave Foreman and John Davis and Reed Noss started talking about wildways and connected lands and connecting parks. And we kept trying things because we were really starting to get some problems in that I guess after 20 years of environmental regulations, there was really a pushback. And Jean Blomberg came out in 1998 with this skeptical environmentalists. So anyway, long story short is that by the time we got to like 1995, we were really looking for new kinds of solutions and trying to inspire the public to care more because it seemed like conservation was stalling out a bit. At the same time, emerging diseases were gathering a lot of notice. And emerging diseases, I think you all know that these are are diseases that are newly appear in a population. Things like AIDS in 1980 got people thinking about it, Ebola, SARS, and the emerging diseases can come about for, different reasons. One is some of them just we had never discovered before that they were around, but others were reemerging. They had been around and then disappeared and came back. But the real fear that started developing or concern was that zoonotic diseases, diseases between animals, were spilling over to people. And this really, because of the relatively little immune response, that it could result in a pandemic. So this was kind of the context and the trajectory of what led up to One Health. But I guess the birthday for One Health was really on April 7th, 2003. And there was an article in the Washington Post by a journalist named Rick Wise. And there was an Ebola outbreak that in the 90s in the Congo was causing a huge decline in great apes, gorillas. And Dr. William Karish, Billy Karish, was there working and connecting Ebola to this decline. And so Rick Wise interviewed him. And in the very last paragraph of the article, Billy said, human or livestock or wildlife health can't be discussed in isolation anymore. There is just, and he used the phrase, one health. And the solutions require everyone working together on all the different levels. So, in many ways, in that very first article in the paper, he set the tone for One Health and the idea that human health, animal health, and ecosystem health are all connected. And he also set the tone that it requires people working together of different disciplines. Well, this article back at WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, where Billy was working in the Global Health Department then, um, it got a lot of play in that they thought they could build on this. And Billy and some other folks at WCS put together a conference that was hosted at Rockefeller University. And Billy called it One World, One Health. And it brought together human experts to discuss current and potential movements of disease among human, domestic, animal, and wildlife populations. But I want to give a historical aside about the field veterinary program at WCS. Um, there was a veterinarian who unfortunately passed away in 1990, and his name was Emil Delenzik. And Emil was the Bronx Zoo veterinarian and he chief veterinarian. And Emil saw the potential really of veterinary medicine being more involved in conservation. At that time, the Bronx Zoo was part of the Wildlife Conservation Society, which has the Bronx Zoo. It has three other city zoos, an aquarium, and now a very large field department. At that time, it was more modest. And he started a field veterinary program. And actually, Billy Karish was the first field vet, but there would be others, Steve Savosky, Sharon Deem, and others. And it's just a reminder that Sometimes you can start a program that can veer off in directions that you never imagined. So a shout out to Emil. Unfortunately, he died at only age 49. So anyway, back to the meeting. And the conclusion of this meeting was that a broader understanding of health and disease demands a unity of approach achievable only through linking together human, domestic animal, and wildlife health. And they used the phrase One Health. The meeting also adopted 12, because the meeting was in Manhattan, Manhattan principles. And the principles were really written by Robert Cook, who was the chief of veterinary medicine at the time at WCS, and Billy and Steve Oskowski, who worked in the global health and they're all field veterinarians. My point is, Emil Delenzek sort of started that field veterinary program, and these field veterinarians and veterinarians in general would play a really large role in the development of One Health. And the principles, you can go to the One Health, One World website. The address is down on the bottom, which is an old website. It's been outdated, but it's still there. And you can also reach it through WCS. But anyway, to summarize those 12 principles, what they said is that the One Health approach incorporates biodiversity conservation into disease policy, strengthens global disease surveillance, regulates high-risk wildlife trade, and promotes multidisciplinary cooperation to contribute to conservation, maintain ecosystem integrity, and safeguard public health. So the primary concern out of that meeting was that One Health was addressing emerging diseases. Again, there was such, maybe fear is the wrong word, but there was such a concern about these zoonotic diseases going over to people and causing pandemics. The governance at that 2004 meeting was voluntary, and this would change as One Health developed over time. But also in the beginning, in 2004, biodiversity was essential to prevent disease. And there was a great link to biodiversity in the scope and the purpose for the meeting. And in that time, again, when conservation biology and conservation biologists were concerned that the public wasn't really picking up on biodiversity conservation, some groups like the Nature Conservancy started testing messages, educational messages. And one word that people would kind of listen to your story about biodiversity was health. People understood health, and they understood that bad water or bad air can cause health problems. There was less awareness that biodiversity loss and species extinction could lead to health issues. So anyway, the 2004 milestone, there's really, again, these ideas don't just come out of thin air, really. And One Health really goes back over 150 years to the idea that animal health and human health are related. And comparative veterinary and human medicine grew over the first 100 years, and public health in general grew. By the got to the 1960s and 1980s, that's when the environmental and conservation movements were really growing, and we were trying to find ways to leverage out the concern. One medicine was out of the University of California at Davis, and it was the idea again, this really the same idea that human health and animal health are related. And the idea was, really there's one medicine. There's not this division between animal health and human health. Again, the 80s and 90s are when these emerging diseases started appearing. And it wasn't just that we were discovering these emerging diseases and, maybe there's been 100 over the last 30 years, but the outbreaks that could lead to pandemics was really accelerating. And the number of these emerging diseases was accelerating. Of course, the reason was because of the connections to degrading environments and ecological health that habitat fragmentation, human population was causing these changes. So 1990 to 2015, that's really the sweet spot for developing One Health, and we'll get to that in a minute. From 2015 to 2020, that's when the institutional support for One Health grew, and it really started accelerating. And more recently, One Health, people have been rethinking it a bit and tying it to broader ideas. So anyway, this is the conservation health approaches that read to One Health, and so we don't need to look at the whole chart, but the framework really kind of went along from ecosystem health to conservation medicine, Ecohealth, which is really just stands for ecological and health brought together, and planetary health. But a couple of things is that in ecosystem health, if you put your eyes on the yellow text, was ecological functioning through systems and interdependence. Conservation medicine in 1996, an important advance was the Consortium for Conservation Medicine, which was the first time really that institutions got together to really try to better improve the collaboration between public health physicians, veterinarians, ecologists, and conservation biologists. And this was a consortium of the Tufts Cummings Veterinary School of Veterinary Medicine, the Harvard Medical School and Wildlife Trust, and eventually also the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. And also at the same time period, that WCS Field Vet program was talking about conservation medicine also. Um, in the early 2000s, a group got together and they expanded the concept really a little bit, and they emphasized more social ecological systems, the human side, and how that affected disease transmission and ecological health, how that directly affected human health. One Health, it really ended up being really like an umbrella term, and many kinds of health. And it would eventually also include things like agriculture and food security and development. But I kind of think of it like ice cream. And One Health is like vanilla, and then there's different flavors, but with slightly different emphasis of the way they're framed, what their purpose is, and also what their values are. What is it that they're really trying to accomplish? And so ecosystem health, conservation medicine, and eco health really all helped different flavors that eventually One Health kind of absorbed. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And if you look at the interest in One Health, so if you look at this graph, this is Google searches relative index, and 2004 is when the Manhattan Principles and that meeting occurred. And One Health, continued to grow somewhat modestly, but it was growing. But then, of course, what happened is 2019, COVID-19 hit. And you can see the dramatic effect that, again, that fear, that concern about pandemics and zoonotic spillover proved to be true, right? And then that just accelerated this idea that in order to address these kinds of emerging diseases, we really had to like understand how to look at the whole system of human health, animal health, and ecosystem health. And we'll talk about the One Health high-level expert panel in a minute, but that's when really the peak happened. Now you can look at a more complicated graph. This is the same graph. So the top line is One Health, but you can also look at how those other flavors of ice cream have made out since then. And you'll see that Ecohealth went along, and so did conservation medicine, and they kept going. And then they also increased in 2019. Planetary health was a newer concept that didn't really get going until 2015, and it has increased. And conservation medicine now, so the lines are the One Health, Eco Health, then planetary, if you look at the right side, planetary health, and then conservation medicine. My point is that all these flavors of ice cream are there. And really, One Health can be an umbrella, but you can define your project, you can analyze projects based on really the inner workings of the definitions. So a classic example of One Health that was used a lot in the beginning was in India, vultures, four different species, collapsed in the 1990s. And this came about because livestock were given a anti-inflammatory drug, diclofenac, and it was a good drug for the cattle in that it prevented things like arthritis or helped them with their arthritis. But when they died, and in India, carcasses are just left out in the field, well, historically, those carcasses were fed on and disposed of by vultures. Sadly, the diclofenac kills vultures. And so then what happened is, and again, it's this whole idea of this, the system, the cascade of effects, that the carcasses were left in the field and the vultures weren't there. And so feral dog population exploded. And sadly, in India, feral dogs still carry rabies and people died. And the carcasses left in the field, there are other kinds of ecosystem effects that not having that taken care of led to problems, and it cost billions of dollars of economic costs. So this was the kind of situation that One Health was looking to address. So during this buildup, from 2004 to the COVID pandemic, One Health really kind of kept growing and growing, and it really became rather, in my mind, generic, in that it became almost fashionable to call your project One Health, and you didn't necessarily have to be addressing all the different issues, and many of them were looking at those zoonotic diseases, but framing it with a One Health banner to it. And there were many examples of this. So this by 2018, it was getting rather confusing on what One Health even really was, and there was no real sort of framework. So the World Bank did a project, and they produced a framework that they thought would help strengthen human, animal, and environmental public health systems. And it's a great reference to look at. It's 172 pages, but the kinds of things that you start to see kind of subtle changes in what One Health addresses. And in this document, it really helped institutionalize One Health. It was no longer just sort of a voluntary approach, but that major government institutions and development organizations were developing the framework together. And the idea was that, having this more rigorous framework, you would do better to prevent, detect, and respond to disease threats. Um, but one change that's noticed in this is that, One Health, it was no longer just about the interdependence of the three kinds of health, but it really became a public health and development environmental strategy. The idea of another kind of paradigm that came out in the 80s was the idea of sustainable development. And so this sort of got merged into One Health, that sustainable development and the environmental strategy. You notice it wasn't necessarily ecosystem health, but it was that, all these emerging diseases, one way or the other, there were human actions that was causing the change in the ecology. And really, it was all about the ecology of disease was changing. So to address all this at the same time, you could address public health. You could have better, more appropriate development, especially in the international situation. And so the focus really out of the framework was to detect outbreaks early. That was the other thing. So we started talking more about monitoring using sentinel species, for example, prevent spillover at the source. So again, the emphasis was, get out in the field, be there, figure out what's going on, and prevent at the source before it could spread and become a pandemic. And it was all about reducing health. And the other thing that you noticed is, I guess it's always the case, the economic impacts were really starting to be appreciated. That vultures dying in India, it was billions of dollars that was the result. So by Um, 2018, it was, I guess, good timing because, or bad timing, whatever, because then in 2019 was COVID. And now, things were really accelerating. And again, that institutionalization, there's a cooperation of four groups on the international stage: FAO, the World Organization for Animal Health, World Health Organization, and the UN Environmental Program. They have a quadripartite collaboration to promote health and environmental sustainability. And they put together an advisory group in 2021. Again, by now, the pandemic, 2019, 2020, 2021, really the wake-up call on just how serious these emerging diseases and just how serious it was not to have a One Health approach. And they put together a high-level expert panel. So again, we see a new definition emerging. And again, each time that One Health, what I want you to pay attention to today is how sort of those original 2004 and conservation medicine and Ecohealth, how those different flavors, they got changed. They kept changing the flavor of what One Health really was. And so the high level panel came out in 2022 with the paper, and we'll read it. An integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustain balance and optimize the health. That was a change to optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognizes the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants. Okay, we realized it isn't just about animals, right? It's about biodiversity. And the wider environment, including ecosystems, are closely linked and interdependent. The word ecosystems got put back in from environmental management, so that was interesting. The other, second part of the definition of One Health from the high level panel was that the approach mobilizes, again, we see multiple sectors, this idea of transdisciplinary disciplines and communities. Communities, in the evolution, who is on the team? At first it was more like scientific experts, but then we realized, especially when you tweaked in the idea of development, that the local stakeholders and the local communities um, needed to be involved. And the idea was, you notice another change, foster well-being. So we started to talk about health in a little bit broader context, although I think the well-being, we really meant the human well-being. Anyway, so while addressing the collective need for clean water, energy, and air, safe and nutritious food, and taking on climate change and sustainable development. So you can see it's really kind of moving more towards the health aspects to counteract emerging diseases, and at the same time, how we move forward with sustainable development, especially in international context. So this definition, really, the primary concerns were really about pandemic prevention. So it was a little bit less than just looking at emerging diseases, but really preventing, and it became much more preventive approach. Antimicrobial resistance, because we were already worrying about that, because of, again, trying to stop these pandemics. Food systems were integrated in, and climate impacts. The governance, that was a big thing to realize that One Health, it became all more and more formal and these larger institutions, and that brought in more money. The biodiversity role, from my perspective, compared to again back to like 2004 where it all started, it was still acknowledged, but it was less central than really public health preparedness, getting ready for those pandemics. And it's anthropocentric, right? Its ethical framework is really human-centered. And actually, all those different flavors of ice cream were really more or less human-centric. Even though when we talked about conservation medicine, we tended to think of it as biocentric or ecocentric. But at the end of the day, we were always really focused on the consequences of humans. So if you want to get started with One Health, there's a lot of things you can do to get started. Now that we've sort of seen the history, um, you can go to Google Scholar, and if you put in One Health, you'll get 2 million links. So go at it, and there's lots of references that you can start to learn from. There's lots of good websites you can look at, of course. I would start with World Health Organization and then that high level expert panel. They have all kinds of information and examples. There's also lots of good books. I still like a 2012 book by Gary Oswald and Dissek. that talks about new directions in conservation medicine, and it will catch you up on like the first 15 years of conservation medicine. Sharon Deem, who again was one of those field vets from WCS, she's now at St. Louis Zoo and has a One Health Center there. She wrote a book in 2019 that I think is a nice textbook if you're going to be teaching One Health to in a classroom setting. But let's now look at some considerations. So you kind of got this flow of how things changed. And the one take-home lesson I want you to learn today is that, One Health is an approach linking human, domestic animal, wildlife, and ecosystem health. But there's all those other different kind of versions that you saw from 2018 to 2022. The point that I want to make is you have the freedom to define your own definition, your flavor. You can make your own, One Health is like an umbrella. It's the ice cream. You have the ability to make your own ice cream flavor, depending on what exactly your project's about. Or when you're reviewing projects that other people have put under this One Health banner, you can start to look at, well, what is it they're really doing? So here's some like thoughts, and I have several slides on this. Um, First of all, what is human health? What is animal health, ecosystem health, and what are the metrics? In the beginning, I think most of us, we just kind of thought of health as absence of disease. And how that's changing now more is you see more talk about well-being and social well-being as much as the absence of disease. But that's a whole issue for another day, but it's something you have to address. Biodiversity, we started talking about animals, domestic animals, and wildlife, but of course, it's really biodiversity, and plants do have an effect. You'll see different definitions when you read different papers, and they'll use the One Health framework, but sometimes they talk about human health, animal health, and ecosystem health. Other times they talk about ecological health. Sometimes they talk about environmental health. Sometimes they talk about environmental management. The point is that you need to understand, which of those and how that then affects your program. An area that's, I think, becoming more and more important is, the animal focus. Is it on species, populations, or individuals? Again, back in the beginning, when I was on the Consortium for Conservation Medicine, we were talking about all of those, but we really were focusing on biodiversity, and there was such, at that time, emphasis on species extinction and species loss that I think most of the One Health was really looking at species and populations, and I think that's changing. Um, I said language begins in the mind of the speaker because, again, remember you have the freedom to define these things. So the other kind of factor that always comes up in these kinds of approaches is that it's multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. And we started out, we were really just thought different disciplines needed to work together and collaborate. But then we started talking about transdisciplinary, and that's really the power of when you put together the program in a right way. The idea is that if the different experts can talk to each other and understand what they're saying to each other, new ideas and new knowledge can emerge. This idea about multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, it also led to discussions about, who has a seat at the table. Is it experts or is it stakeholders? And that was the idea that, local folks involved should be part of the team. There also is the interesting idea of who wants a seat at the table. Back in the early days of 1995 or so, a lot of veterinarians wanted to get involved because they saw the need. And public health physicians, they all wanted to be more involved in biodiversity conservation. And so they looked, and their role is very important. Um, so you need to understand, who benefits from the project. What's the scope? Is it science, environmental education, or public health? Also, you should realize that marketing and fundraising always become part of the issue. And the best name award for all those different flavors of ice cream was One Health. People get it right away. And I think it's one reason why the One Health paradigm took off because simply it was the best name. And when you go in and use, you'll see people go in and use One Health, and it's sometimes like a bartering tool, because a lot, especially in developing countries, communities need human health, right? And so it becomes a chip really that you can play. That makes it sound terrible. I don't mean it in a bad way, but it's that you can drive an interest in a broader vision of health by bringing people what they desperately need, which is different aspects of human health. This idea of that be careful what you ask for, that One Health is incredibly complicated systems. And, you need to, are you really a reductionist or a holistic? Do you want to you're trying to work on the whole system or just a piece of it? What's the time frame? When you start talking about systems, the time frame is long and the funding is great. One thing on the horizon is that AI and machine learning are going to help us and other new tools to understand systems better. So, just to start to wrap up, um, one thing that I've noticed in this, observation over 20 some years is that there's an avoidance of discussing values or ethics, and I'm not sure exactly why. I think we just never really kind of appreciated that policy comes about from facts and values. And again, because of the conservation biology really taking a very hard approach at science and research, we kind of thought science was the answers and didn't realize the connection to policy and actually changing things on the ground. Um, I recommend, be transparent, explicitly link the project's why and how. Because again, a lot of times we kind of get started and just sort of assume that the people that we're going to work with are going to have the same why and how. And again, remember, language begins in the mind, your mind, and what you define as terms and what your values are obviously can be very different than the people you're working with. You have to be more explicit. And One Health and its variations are still largely anthropocentric, even though we talk about, linking the interdependence. Joanne, who presented last time, Lindemeyer, wrote a paper in 2022, and she came up with four tenets. And Bill also worked on this, and so did I, the same paper that could serve to kind of help explore ethics. One Health recognizes the interdependence of health and well-being among people, other animals, and nature. One Health incorporates physiological, mental, emotional, and social well-being, regardless of the species, as well as the physical systems and ecological integrity of nature. Notice we use nature. One Health strives to achieve optimal health. Again, you're seeing that simultaneously for humans, other animals, and nature, and accommodates trade-off and may not privilege only humans. That's a big deal. One Health acknowledges scientific uncertainty and our limited understanding of a complex and changing world. One Health is no different from other arenas of scholarship undertaken for the good of individuals and a broader community of life. It should extend our care and compassion to all humans and other animals and nature. So, um, I started by showing you the context, a general context. But there's really, in a way, two kinds of contexts. There's the external, which I showed in that earlier slide, where we went through all the different things that were happening in conservation biology that led to One Health. But there's always like the internal context, and that's yourself and your own set of values. And the idea is that you can take the context and ideas and paradigms emerge from it, combined with your own internal views, and you can, transcend the present. That's a fancy way of just saying, you can be visionary and change things. So I have some questions, and we can first take some questions. We still have 15 minutes. We can talk about, you can bring up any questions you want to have. But I have actually three questions that I was hoping that some of you might want to talk about. Does today's biodiversity and societal context and your own internal values suggest new directions for One Health projects? So what I'm saying is, has the context changed, and that the One Health approach maybe a new flavor of ice cream or just new ways of defining it, new emphasis. Um, how should we prioritize among the health of ecosystem, species, humans, or other animals? I find that as an ethical question that is really out there now and starting to get a lot of talk and discussion. How do we balance among the health of all these different levels, including the individual animals? And then finally, what do you see as the role of ethics, philosophy for One Health projects moving forward? How can we improve this kind of reluctance to talk about the ethics behind One Health projects? So with that, maybe Bernie and Bill can jump back on and start the discussion.
That sounds good, Fred. Do you want to close down your slideshow?
Okay.
That way we can get people seeing each other. All right, who would like to start us off? We have these wonderful questions that Fred has posed, and of course, we have your expertise and knowledge and interest to draw upon. Who has the first question? I'm looking who's here. Actually, I see a name that a person I haven't talked to in a long time who might have something to say. Billy, are you here? Are you online such that you can turn on your voice and perhaps your camera?
Yeah, one thing I'm going to interrupt Billy. One thing I wanted to say that if you start to look at the history of One Health, Billy is like always there in the background. I don't want to say he's Forrest Gump of
I
One
like
Health.
being, that's where I like to be.
But he's always there. Like he's always showing up in the pictures and the acknowledgments. And he's been this thread through One Health the entire time. And so I thought, Billy, you might want to say a few words. And look at his wall there, One Health Concepts. You might want to say a few words about, play off some of the things I said, some of the things I didn't say that I should have said, and kind of get the conversation going today.
Well, I loved your presentation, Fred. That was really a great review. So congrats on pulling all that together. It was really excellent. I don't know what I could add. I mean, there's lots of anecdotes, and I, people have been asking me more because I think as you're seeing, or everybody's seeing, that it is going in many directions, and I think that's great. And in the early days, it was interesting to see who, like you mentioned, who got engaged and who didn't, um, and who used it to their advantage and who didn't find it as useful. So I think those are all still true today. Um, and of course, I was very naive in the beginning. In my mind, it was an opportunity to find groups that traditionally didn't work together to work together more. Even if we didn't have the same goals or we didn't have the same mission, maybe the big mission statement, but a few of the steps along the way would be mutually beneficial. So I was thinking a lot about collateral benefits of working with others, even though they weren't actually trying to achieve the same thing. So, my experience, like working a lot with the Defense Department, clearly their goal was not our goal. But there were a lot of things we could do together that were mutually beneficial. But I mentioned naive because I don't think now looking back, I have a better understanding of human nature. But so in the beginning, there was a lot of immediate jumping into different groups trying to define it, as you pointed to. They wanted to define it so it fit what they were doing. And then some groups were really about the arguments broke out to who should be in control,
Hmm.
who controls One Health, and that's always been sad to see because I thought the point was that none of us get to be in control. It was really about working together. Um, so you see, some of that's happened and has been detrimental. And then in other cases, it's just been fascinating to watch how people have picked it up and really put the ideas to good use. So I think I'll just stop there. And I'm still entertained and fascinated by watching the progressions and the different directions. I love that you pointed out at the end there about taking it in new directions, and why not? If it's useful, please, everybody should be taking advantage of that if it works for them. Thanks.
Thank you, Billy.
Joanne?
Yeah, hi, I'm here with Gretchen Kaufman. I think Bill, you may know Gretchen.
Sure.
Um, and so I just want to address the question that you asked at the end, Fred, about the ethics, because it's something that I think about a lot today. And we propose these four, I guess, Bill, you would call them normative principles as opposed to axiomatic principles. Is that correct?
Close enough.
No, I misspoke last week.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm still learning about ethics, but the thing that is, I guess, what I'd like to have some discussion on is there, given how broad this idea, the concept, and the approach of One Health is it even possible to have an ethics of One Health that would apply in almost all or perhaps all circumstances? Or is it perhaps more like Chris Degling believes that every situation, whether it's culling of dogs or forced migration with or without with other animals, or food safety, does each one of these have its own ethical considerations, and therefore there can't possibly be anything that sort of ties all this One Health stuff together in an ethical sense? I would really love to hear some other people's opinions about this, because I think about it all the time. And anyway, yeah, so I'm going to leave it there.
What do you think, Fred?
Well, first of all, I want to say hi to Gretchen. Gretchen was a colleague that was on the Consortium for Conservation Medicine back in what started in 1996 and was headquartered for a while at Tufts, where Gretchen was. But that's why I was trying to today emphasize that language begins in the mind of the sender. And so what I mean by that is I think the projects need to be clear on what the project is about, what the purpose is, what the why is, the how, and the ethical framework for that particular project. So, I guess we can still have this banner of One Health, but I think what's most important is that within the projects, you realize, what it is you're really trying to accomplish and what the values are for that techniques and, the how, the methods you use. But I know what you're saying.
Yeah, I guess something that I'm going to be suggesting in an editorial, which I don't think we have now. If you do say a scientific project, say you're using non-human animals in some laboratory research, you have to say, "Yeah, we submitted to the IACOC and blah 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 blah," or using human subjects. I'd really like to see something similar applied to projects that are called One Health. What are those types of principles, human subject research, Animal Welfare Act types of principles that govern research in certain species of animals? I'd like to see people clarify what are the ethical considerations that they bring to these individual projects. I'd like to see a statement like that goes along with One Health projects and research in particular. What do you think about that?
Well, Billy was another thing he was in was the World Bank's operational framework, which in a way was the idea of trying to standardize things more. I don't think they dove too deeply into like ethics. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was the idea of an operational framework. So I think you're right, Joanne. I think what you almost need is part of an operational framework, um, an approach to how you define the values that are driving your project. So it could almost be like a companion document, and then I guess it's the recipe for the ice cream, right? And that recipe should be not just the operational framework, but it should be, what's driving you to take that approach, because the approach is so large, right? And that gets back to, again, the flavors. Conservation medicine was really more about ecosystem health, human health, and animal health, um, because it together created ecological health, and ecological health uh, eventually created a better world to live in. Yeah, Billy, you're right. We were younger in those days, weren't we? And like we were really pretty damn idealistic, right? I mean, we really thought we were like creating a healthy world. Um, while I'm thinking of it, though, one thing that I think is that we really missed was a lot of the One Health leaders came from the Eastern United States. At the same time, the Western United States had some really great thinking about environmental sociology. And when we were forming those teams, there was a reluctance to really look at the human dimension completely. I really wish, like I got this book right here, people like William Catton, who wrote Overshoot. I wish like he would have been part of the team in the beginning, because we were kind of had a reluctance not only of ethics, but in a way we also had a reluctance of looking at some of the really overarching big problems. And so I think that was a mistake. I'm drifting now, I'm blabbering, but I think that the framework always has a human ethical side to it. It's just that, and that picture in my slide, that slippery slope. So many times when you start talking about ethics, it's a slippery slope, and whatever. Billy, I see your hands there.
I can't hear you.
Billy.
Bill, you're muted.
Thank you. A question really kind of for Joanne about what it means and how to implement it. I think, like Fred mentioned with the World Bank, when we did that framework for them, it ended up directing, now they tell me over $3 billion of
Wow.
World Bank funding has gone through the filter of that framework. And
Wow.
I think internally at the bank, they have their own ethical frameworks that also have to be met in that process. I don't know if they're good or they're bad. If you think about the 50-year history of the World Bank, I don't know how it compares modern day. But I'm wondering too, I guess my question, Joanna, is this like becomes a regulatory thing that when you propose a ethical framework, and who, once again, who controls that and who enforces that, and is that though I think it could be added, you could get that added to the funders. If funders are making those decisions about what to support and what not to support, and maybe there's a place there to give them an ethical framework to work from. And that generally, I hate to also sound so capitalist, but money tends to drive a lot of direction in what we can and can't do without it.
Yeah, it raises this question about whether ethical banking is an oxymoron. But of course, we can joke about that. But at the same time, budgets are moral documents. They're laden with the values that people bring to building those budgets and what gets done in the world using resources. So it's perfectly valid and reasonable for the World Bank to be thinking about its ethical criteria. And having looked at the World Bank's ethical criteria in the past, it is a very anthropocentric project. Animals and nature are there as resources for humans, and maybe we want to keep them around for heritage sake or use sake, but thinking about their own well-being, much less us having direct duties to them to act for their well-being and to sustain or improve their health in a multidimensional way, is definitely not something the World Bank is thinking about, at least not to my knowledge. But it'd be wonderful if it did. Joanne, I'm going to come back to you in a second. Barbara, I have two things to say. One is we're slightly over time. So there may be some of you who need to leave now, but Fred, if you're okay with staying for a while longer, okay, we can continue to go on. I know Bernie is going to have to leave us in a few minutes.
Okay.
Thank you so much for getting us all started, Bernie, and don't worry, I'll take care of the recording and everything. But I wanted to ask, Barbara had a comment about Iacooks that I thought was really relevant here about how Iacooks actually practice and raising questions about the practice of ethics and how it is well implemented or not well implemented. Could you share that with us, Barbara?
Yes. Hi, Bill. Joanne, hi. What
Hey,
I wrote
Barbara.
in the chat was, Joanne, I hear you when you were talking about this wish to, come up with a mechanism for integrating ethics. But of course, IACUCs, for example, have no mandate to consider ethics,
I
and
know.
people outside the system often wrongly assume they do. We need a new framework for integrating ethics, values, and science in One Health, indeed, as we do at PAN. And this stems from my personal experience in IACUCs, but of course also reading a lot about them. We know the composition of IACUC committees are very much self-serving, people who
Yep.
are invested in the research. So I don't mean to come down too hard and pick on the examples you use, but we need to get out of that framework, don't you think?
Are you asking me, Barbara?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
curious.
absolutely. No, I think we do. And it's sadly, I think, I j- uh, and we may end up going on to a phone Zoom because the battery's dying here in northern Vermont. But I think that it's very clear. But Fred was making the point that biodiversity is related to human health. There is some scholarship around that idea, and I think that what we're going to have to do is to say ultimately we need to conserve biodiversity. Wait, we're switching over right now. We need to oh, sorry.
Okay.
Well, we'll come back to it. We'll pick that up in a second. At their point, I think one of the things that your point of view brings up, Barbara, and I think you're absolutely right, is animals themselves have to be represented at the table during these discussions about One Health, during these discussions about conservation and the integration with One Health, and they're often not. There are humans representing their perspectives, and there are people perhaps thinking about the larger questions of biodiversity, but the individual animals or the animals in their social groups, such as their families, etc., they get lost from that kind of discussion.
Yeah, I do agree with you that the agency and autonomy, the interior lives of animals, all of these things are lost. And now that Joanne is back, I will yield to you again, Joanne.
Yeah, no, I really want to continue this. It's but with you and with others. But it seems to me that what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to say, if we acknowledge that the health of other animals and plants too, if we're losing all the banana plants to a disease, then people are going to starve. We're going to have to develop some ethics that says ultimately we need to take care of other animals and plants because our own health is on the line. And it may not be what Bill is talking about for their own because of their own inherent value and worth, which I truly believe in. But we may have to make this sort of circuitous argument that we need to do that because ultimately, whether it's today or 10 years from now, our health is going to depend on the survival of the human species will depend on it. Does that sound crazy?
No, not at all. I understand completely where you're coming from. I think in my framework, I would say take care of animals and plants, but I would also add a kind of co-constitutive process where there's a negotiation, really listening to, being with animals, particularly animals and plants, so that it's not a top-down decision-making, protective, taking care of as much as it is an emergent from observation, interaction, listening, looking.
I absolutely agree with that.
Mhm.
I absolutely agree with that. I'm not saying that we should be making those decisions because only because of our own health. I think we have to be listening. Um, but it seems to me that there's a role for ethics within that. I,
Well,
I don't
there's
know. Somebody help me out here.
I think one of the things that helps to us to avoid is thinking that these questions at health for people or health for animals or health for nature, health for individuals, health for systems are necessarily oppositional, or they're,
Right.
they're a winner, a
Exactly.
win and lose choice. There are win-win choices all around here. There's no reason to diminish the well-being of animals or nature in order to promote the well-being of humans, and we could ramify that out otherwise. And One Health gives us that opportunity because when you're talking about health, you are talking about well-being, whether it's physiological, psychological, social, environmental. And that always is an ethical question because it's always raising issues about who is being harmed, who is being benefited, what are the consequences of one's actions. Those are all ethical questions that are always embedded in practicing or thinking about One Health for conservation.
Yeah, I think that what we've talked about last week a little bit is that the practitioners of One Health, the people like Billy that are out on the ground, um, we, we don't really have the training in how to
Right.
have a philosophical discussion.
Right.
And again, I think Billy brought up the point, like money often rules and humans always come first. And each project is very context specific. Each one's a case in itself. But what we need more of is to be able to have a transdisciplinary approach to
Yeah.
including philosophers really in
Yeah.
having these difficult conversations. And
Mhm.
there isn't going to be like one answer, like 30% effort goes to humans, 30% goes to ecosystems, 30%,
Right.
it's not going to be like that at all, right? But what we don't really have is, again, it's so hard to get different experts together, and philosophers are one set of experts that really haven't been in the discussion um, in a practical approach, in a practical kind of ethics.
You are absolutely right, Fred. We include social scientists, anthropologists, but rarely have, if ever, have philosophers and ethicists been involved in those discussions in that multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach. You're right.
It's changing though, and I think part of the reason is because medical ethics has gotten so much stronger in the last 30 years. In general. And I think that now, again, making those links between medical, more traditional medical ethics and then including the One Health along those lines, if you can get some of those medical ethicists to look beyond humans, that is.
Mhm.
I know we're kind of going over. I don't
Yeah.
want people to feel obligated to stay here. Um, Bill, is there do you see any people that haven't spoken? Is there anybody that
I'm
hasn't really said much? I see
yes,
that Teresa mentioned about the idea that maybe some of the anthropomorphism, is that a word, can be lessened by a community-based approach. And I think you're absolutely right. Again, that could help. Again, we kind of went into this thinking everybody had to be an expert. And no, everybody just has to have a human interest in stake in it. I see Billy shaking his head. Yes.
Yeah.
well then
And
why
I
don't
think
we go ahead.
I just
Go
want to
ahead,
say I
Glenn.
think we'll see more of that from Dr. Kalima Zukosoka when
Yes.
she gives her
Yes.
presentation.
Yes, we're looking for that. So it's so, just to wrap us up here, we started out with Joanne's excellent presentation, which gave us a theoretical overview. We've had a very sort of practical historical contextualization from Fred. And then we're going on to Dr. Gladys, who's going to give us a very practical instantiation of One Health as applied to mountain gorilla conservation. So we're intentionally trying to do that that praxis we talked about originally, trying to bring theory and the actual practice together. So it's not just all, so this ethics stuff isn't all just talking heads. And I'm really looking forward to the next version of this. Thank you so much, Fred. This has been really, really helpful and really interesting. And thank the rest of you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
I see y'all.
All right. How do we turn this off?
Bye-bye, folks.
Ah, God.